Joining me now is Charles Wheelan. He is a senior lecturer and policy fellow with the Rockefeller Center at Dartmouth College. Also joining us from Virginia is David Swanson. He's an author, journalist, and radio host, and he's the director of worldbeyondwar.org, O-R-G. Welcome to both of you to the show. Charles, let me start with you. We just heard that report there. When we look at those figures, we see the gap is so wide, so stark. Has it always been like this, or is this a relatively new phenomenon?
No, I think we're seeing some significant trends that are not likely to reverse themselves anytime soon. I think focusing on the hyper-rich may lead us away from the fundamental problem, however, which is that people at the bottom end of the labor market are just not commanding the incomes that they were before relative to everybody else. So the most likely scenario from a policy standpoint is to try and upskill those folks as opposed to focusing on the people who are making a lot of money and trying to punish them.
So when you say they're not commanding the kind of money that they should be getting or that they need to upscale, whose fault is that?
Well, we would like to blame it politically on a bad guy. In fact, when you look at where jobs have been lost, the most significant bad guy is technology. Over the last 20 or 30 years, the personal computer, the internet, other kinds of technological change have made low-skilled workers redundant at the same time that they've made high-skilled workers more productive. Something like the personal computer allows somebody at General Electric to design a jet engine more quickly, more efficiently, and therefore get paid more. At the same time, it makes redundant somebody who's a ticket taker at the theater or used to be a secretary who's now been replaced by voicemail. So technology is the bad guy, but of course that's not something you can rail against in a political campaign.
David, what do you think? Is technology the culprit here, or is it a combination of various things, like technology, like the political system, like the economic system, like the tax system? What's driving this?
I think, as Bernie Sanders would quickly point out, that technology exists in many countries, and this level of rising inequality does not exist in many countries. So what's the difference? A recent academic study found that the U.S. government is truly an oligarchy. It's not a democratic republic. It doesn't represent the will of the people. If it were run by public referendum, it might do some very ugly things, but it would almost certainly restore value to the minimum wage, provide free quality education up through college, provide public transportation and child care and retirement, provide universal free health care. The fact is that working people in this country have to take their shrinking paycheck and pay for all kinds of things that in other countries, less wealthy countries, the government provides.
Well, you say, technology like the technology that exists in the United States also exists in other countries, but they don't have the similar kind of inequality. Give us an example of that.
Well, nations in Europe, nations in Asia, nations in Scandinavia in particular, as Bernie Sanders is endlessly pointing to as a model, in many cases not quite as wealthy overall as the United States, but with far better distribution of income, which is what people in the United States would want and would enact policies to create if they were able to control the government, which is in fact run by an ever-shrinking number of people. It's not even the 1% anymore, and I think it's worth paying a little bit of attention to this. Those top 20 people with as much money as half the country put together, that's the 0.000006%, if I've got my math right. I mean, this is medieval, if not beyond medieval levels of inequality.
Charles, what do you think? Other countries, as David points out, have the similar kind of technology, but they don't have the same kind of inequality. I mean, let's look at, let's say, Scandinavia. Okay, that might be an extreme example, but if we look at countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland, certainly these are countries with very high technology or technological advances. They don't have this inequality.
Well, they do see the same basic growing inequality. I would agree with David in that it's buffered by higher tax rates, so you see more redistribution. You don't see the enormous disparity in pay between CEO and everyday workers, and you do see much greater investment in people at the lower end of the spectrum, things like common schooling, preschool education, those kinds of things. But the fundamental shift that's going on in the economy, this higher returns to skill, is something that's going on everywhere. And I think if you neglect that, I mean, let me point out something that, a figure that the economist pointed out not too long ago. If you look at the gap in median income between two-person households where both parents have a college degree and two-person households where both persons have only a high school degree, that gap in income is larger and is growing at a faster rate than the gap between the 1% and the 99% that we're so fond of talking about. So I think if you move too far away from what's really going on in the labor market, which is a rising return to skills, then I think you lose sight of what ultimately is going to reverse what's going on, which is making the folks at the bottom end of that labor pool more productive.
Okay, well, joining us now is Julianne Malveaux. She is, I'll get to you in a moment, David, is Julianne Malveaux. She is a labor economist, author, and political commentator. Julianne, welcome to the show.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, well, let me ask you, we've been talking about what's the driving force between these huge inequality gaps that we see in the United States, income inequality, wealth inequality. What do you think is creating this gap?
Part of it is the tax code. If you look at the tax code, what you've seen is that we have basically enabled the wealthy and ignored the poor. I want to inject just for a moment the issue of race when we talk about what's going on in terms of, as my colleague just said, the bottom two-parent households and the top. What you'll see, frankly, is that when women are leading households, there's a major challenge in terms of what happens with income and gaps. And when there are African-American women, and about 45% of African-American households are led by women, you see an even greater gap. But part of the challenge here has been that people have not paid attention to what taxes have done to enable the wealthy. People have simply not paid attention to that, and then we've had these people, and they're not all Republicans. There have been some Democrats who've been there too, but who believe that if you work hard, you get ahead, and they basically have not looked at structural classism and structural racism. How do you have people who work at Walmart who earn $9 an hour when you look at what the top people there earn? How do you have people, Barbara Ehrenreich has written brilliantly about the many ways that people are disadvantaged just by doing their work. You see folks who don't have health care, don't have family and medical leave. All the things that we think for major employers ought to be offered, they're not being offered to a lot of people. And so, you know, this is a really appropriate conversation to have about what's going on and who is at the bottom.
Oh, I just want to get your take very quickly on what Charles Wheelan said just a moment ago about the fact that the big culprit here is also technology. And we know that. We call a big corporation now, we call their customer service department. We end up talking to a machine, not to a person.
You know, technology can be our friend and technology can make us slaves. In other words, we can manage technology. And I don't think we've tried to do that. When we look at technology, of course, you know, I tried to order pizza the other day. Do you want pepperoni? Press 1. You know? So we've taken people out of the mix. We've done it with airline reservations. We've done it with other places. Contrast, I was in Brazil about 2 years ago. I walked into a mall. They had several young people to direct me to the store that I want to go to. Didn't speak a bit of Portuguese, but they were like there. And we can decide that we want to have employment. We have not decided it, nor have we provided tax incentives so our young people have the opportunity to work. I was a college president from 2007 to 2012. The class of 2008 got their hind parts kicked. They walked into the employment situation in terms of a recession, and they have not yet recovered. Why not? Because many of our employers have not said it's a priority for our young people to be engaged. And so the comment is very much on time, and we have to figure out how we can manage to engage our young people in productive work.
And David, getting back to the point of the fact that we may be focusing too much on the extremes in this debate, you know, the poor and the very rich. But as Charles pointed out, there is that inequality inside that gap.
Yeah, but it doesn't just happen like the weather, this gap between college-educated and non-college educated. We can choose, like other nations, to make college free and available to everyone so that people who want to go to college and qualify to go to college can afford to without tens of thousands of dollars in debt hanging over them. And we can make non-college jobs pay good money. There's no reason not to allow labor organizing. There's no reason not to have a basic income guarantee, not to provide jobs through a civilian conservation corps. I mean, these are all steps that governments can take. And many governments are taking steps to provide jobs and to provide higher incomes and to provide security and health and housing that the U.S. government is not taking because of who controls it. And I think Julianne is exactly right that race is a huge part of it. That Forbes 400, the 400 billionaires that now have as much as 61% of the country, according to Institute for Policy Studies, and that's just the money they can find, not counting offshore hidden funds. That's as much as all African Americans and a third of Latino households in the country put together. Those 400 people, the racial wealth gap is enormous and growing, and is the result of policies taken and not taken by our governments.